Hey, I want to welcome Tom Sweet to Elevate Exchange Epic Broadcast. And it's been a while since we had an opportunity to talk. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what's been going on and how you've been?
Thanks. I think one of the last times we spoke, I was working at GM Financial. I was VP of Cloud Services there. That was a really great company. I had an awesome team. And in that role, despite the fact I was working and responsible for basically cloud engineering, it was a big enough IT team that I learned a lot across all different areas, specifically governance, risk, compliance, privacy, and cybersecurity. About half of my job was that. So even though I wasn't in the one of those other teams, we had over 1,000 cyber controls for cloud. We had privacy, went through the whole audit process. Learned a lot about all that. And I actually won an award for Audit Partner of the Year, which means I spent a lot of time with Audit to win the award. And so, I've been looking for a CIO role for a while. And as you know, I had a couple of close opportunities. Came close on some, but didn't get it done. And so this opportunity came up for Industrial Refrigeration Pros, the private equity-backed company. So I work with mergers and acquisitions. I do due diligence in that area. And as we grow the company, I am definitely rolling up my sleeves in a lot of areas. So I'm basically responsible for almost everything. I mean, we do have some contracts for support that we have with different companies purchase, but I'm doing everything or responsible for everything from end-user computing to network architecture to cybersecurity, filling out the cyber insurance questionnaires and attesting to the controls that we have in place, trying to do long-term planning, mail migration. This is a lot of fun. I mean, before I took this role, one gentleman that we know said that, these types of roles are so much fun. And it is, right? It's great. I mean, no one tells me what to do. I don't necessarily get to do what I want, right? In any role, you have things that you may not want to do, but regardless, it's your responsibility to do. But day to day, it's a lot of fun, and I enjoy it, and I'm able to get things done. And with a smaller company, you don't have huge change management boards and all those different handoffs that you might have in a larger company. So I'm loving it.
Oh, that's great. And you're right. No matter what role you have, you always typically have someone to answer to, including even being the CEO. You've got the board to answer to, right? And then in your own personal life, typically you have your partner in life to answer to. So,
I report to the CEO, right? I mean, he can give me direction and such, but he's not telling me how to run it, right? I'm making decisions, and that's good and that's bad, right? It's good that I'm the one who makes the decision, but I'm ultimately accountable for the decisions I make. And if I make wrong decisions, then I'll pay the ultimate consequence, right? There isn't really a performance improvement plan for CIOs, right?
No, there's not.
You're replaced, so.
Exactly. Well, so let's get started in some of the conversation and everything else, and some of the things we want to look at. And it's really kind of talking about, governance, risk, and compliance in what we do today and how it works. And so one of the first questions I want to kind of talk about and touch on is, like, in today's digitized era, everything's interconnected: people, processes, organizations, and especially the risks. How has this complicated things for the role of a GRC leader or the CIO and in those areas when you cannot look at them in isolation anymore?
Everything is connected, and so when you approach it, and there's small company, there's large company, right? When you look at a small company, especially if you're acquiring smaller companies, family-owned businesses, right? A lot of times they take the approach of everyone's trusted and everything's wide open. We have no secrets. Some of them may have secrets for payroll or some of the financials, but all the data is wide open. And so that's one problem with a smaller company. And a larger company, especially they're taking a zero trust architecture approach, you can have data that people can't get at. So let's just back up to the first piece, right? So when you have a smaller company with no controls everything's wide open, and then you have a lot of risk around data loss prevention. If you have someone who says, hey, I'm going to start my own company, let me just copy all this data to a USB key just in case I need, or someone's compromised, right? Because a lot of times smaller companies just don't have the same level of cybersecurity and the same expertise in those areas. So they may have some really weak cyber controls, and then they get compromised because one person uses the same password for book and for email and for the workplace, and then that person gets compromised and goes out. And again, now to the second half, which is a larger company, is you have situations where people just can't get their job done, right? There's layer upon layer of security, and there's approvals and delays and handoffs, and someone's like, you don't need to have this. It's like, well, I asked for it because I do need it. And I've come across that in my past where sometimes information is withheld for, sometimes right reasons, sometimes just withheld for wrong reasons. And when you have layer upon layer, and you have sometimes a culture of fear where someone's afraid, if I give an internal employee access to data, then I'm accountable for what he or she does with it. But with that comes business delays and ultimately delays in delivering value to a customer. So that's a piece of it. And a lot of times, given the number of tools, number of different groups within a larger IT organization, data gets dispersed in many places and no one really knows where it is. And despite maybe a cybersecurity team's best effort in keeping data from exfiltrating, like shadow IT, fusion, and new technologies are always coming into an organization, being able to track where that data goes. Given my new role, I have a really great appreciation for the work that CIOs do.
I was going to ask you, do you have a new appreciation for that?
Not that I didn't before, but I may not have had all the empathy I should have.
But one of the other things, and I'm sure that you're going, if you haven't experienced it already, you will be experiencing it where you are now, is where you have non-normal knowledge workers that ultimately sometimes need access to data and systems and stuff to be able to do things. Enrollment, for an example, right? Where they all of a sudden get credentials and everything else, and because they don't spend a lot of time doing that, they're not as careful as others are, not as well understanding of that. And what's some of the steps that you can take to make sure that you're still protecting the environment whenever you have that type of thing happening?
So part of it's education, and with education, it depends who you're educating. If you're educating IT, people in the IT field, it's a little easier for them to pick up on it. It's much harder with business users who are struggling to remember passwords or trying to understand why they need this multi-factor authentication, or why do we need to confirm our location on a map to make sure that it's me. And so, but to answer your question a little more fully here, I think having a good role-based authentication is important, right? Making sure that the users have least privilege, making sure that there is that separation of duties. Now, with that comes a cost of implementation, of complexity, of documentation, and you can run afoul of it by going too far down the deep end. It is the principle of least privilege. However, if there are 50,000 files, you're not going to always break it down file by file. You're going to break it down by directory, and you're going to try to simplify it within reason. It is hard, right? And this is why these problems exist, and this is why we're having this conversation. It is finding that balance between how you deliver value, how you protect the data, versus making it so complex that no one can figure it out.
And so that kind of leads into the next question, right? And one of the things that the business is starting to demand more of is having more agility, but still maintaining resilience. and that's really becoming more and more at the forefront about what's going on. And there's many more dimensions coming into play, right? We already have the cyber threats that we've always had. There's issues that are happening with climate change that affect, satellite reception and things like that. And then you start taking into play geopolitical dynamics with nation states, culture in itself, and then the impacts, as we all felt with coronavirus and the variants there that are coming around. It'll always test the resilience of an organization, right? I remember whenever I was at my last role, all of a sudden taking an organization that was, everybody was in the office working every day, and taking everybody and saying, oh, well, you're going to start working from home. We did it in 2 weeks for 1,400 people. It makes you rethink how you do things and what you do. So, as a leader, what do you find the most challenging in finding that balance of agility and resilience, along with keeping, control of the risk and the compliance that needs to happen?
Yeah, that's a hard question. If you go back to GM Financial when I was there, we were a little bit fortunate in that with IT, we were going through a building remodel, and based on that remodeling, one of the floors had to completely work remote. And GM Financial prior had been the type of company that was, no, you can't ever work remote. Always in the office. But they had to do a sort of remote work for the remodel just due to the number of staff. And it just wasn't to have the staff work during that disruption. And then COVID happened. And so IT was already in a really great position because we had all that in place. And then it was a little bit more difficult for some of the different business groups, because a lot of them had desktops. They didn't have laptops because that was the nature of the role. But when you look across at industry now, many companies are talking about return to work or return to work 3 days a week, or however that is. The employees know that many companies, especially larger ones, made record profits the past couple in 2022, but in 2020, 2021, they made record profits because a lot of the smaller companies just went out of business, or they weren't able to be considered a critical employer and critical product. And so now you're telling employees that, hey, you know what, you worked remote 2 years, and we made tons of money because you worked 60 hours a week, and now we're going to have you go back in the office. They're going to be, no. In fact, I actually had a job posting I had put back in my last role where they said, if your manager wants you to go back into the office, contact us, work remote. And then that was the plan. So that company now has talked about going back to the office. I know a lot of people were hired on fully remote roles. It's going to be hard to make that change. You have to think about when resiliency, one thing that people aren't always thinking about is staffing, right? Because people can, especially for individual contributors, they can pick up and go someplace else pretty easy, especially if they have skills. And we also have to think about, current situations such as what's going on with Ukraine and that whole situation with potential war, and how are we going to get electricity? I think that's the other piece that people are not necessarily thinking about. It is all, we talk about electric cars, or we're going to talk about banning gas heaters in California and in generators, right? How are we going to get electricity, right? And where's that coming from? Because I do have a background in mining. So at one point I worked in mine planning software, and electric mills and electric motors all require solar panels, require a specific cobalt or different lithium and different minerals, and where do these come from? They're mined, and mining causes disruption of the environment. You have to have trucks to mine, you have to have fuel, you have to have explosives, you have to have treatment plants to filter out the different metals, and they're usually in big what do you call it, on a pool, like a lagoon, right? And so there's risk of pollution there. So there's a lot to this, and companies sometimes are not taking big picture there. They're looking for a short-term solution for ESG, but I think it's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, don't disagree with that at all. You know, one of the things that I remember talking and having some conversations with some people about leaders that were working in companies that were in the office that they sent everybody home have turned around and moved away from the office area completely. Their hours sometimes in different states now and working remotely, and now being faced with the thing of being asked to come back to work. And so the company is having to make decisions of, do I lose that knowledge? Do I lose that great leader that helped build the culture that we have? Or do we modify our plans? And some of them are taking hardline stances and saying, if you want to keep your job, move back. And people are taking the option of moving on.
I mean, that's tough, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so what? I mean, is working, and depends what you're doing. Now, if you're building automobiles, right, you have to be in the office to build the car. But a lot of what's happened with the remote work is, again, the companies were super successful. What is the purpose of bringing them back in? What is it going to solve? To show that you're the boss and you're going to do what I say? People are going to say, no, I don't have to.
Exactly.
People aren't wedded to jobs anymore, especially, you know, the younger you are, the less apt you are to continue to be loyal, make the days of 20 or 40 years are over.
And there's been several studies that have been done and everything else over the last 2 years of people working remotely, and they're finding that on the average, they're finding a 30% productivity increase with remote working. How do you justify bringing people back in?
I don't disagree, right? Because I start work before breakfast.
Yeah.
I start working after dinner sometimes. It's not thinking if I don't want to log in on the weekend to go check something or to do a mail migration or DNS. I can just go do that. I don't have to have like
get
some
kicked off.
phone call at 2 a.m. and big meeting.
And I hate to say, if I'm in the office, I take the commute, drive into the office, I do my time. When I leave from there, I don't bring my laptop back out and get back on. That's the end of my day when I leave. And I think most people are that way, you know, and it definitely impacts the ability to have higher levels of productivity. All right. As we all know, the role of the CIO is evolving, right? And we're now integral to the business innovation, and while balancing operational excellence, that's being governed by the ever-changing demands of both GRC, of both the IT and the business. Can you provide some insights on how this has changed your leadership and the relationship with leadership with not only the business but also with IT?
Sure, and this is always a touchy subject, and I get in, I don't want to say arguments, but I have a number of people who I respect greatly and who respect me, but we just disagree. The role of the CIO has changed, right? At one point, it was really a technical role, and then I think it pivoted. The pendulum went way to the other side, and the CIO was a business person who knows nothing about IT, but knows relationships or knows how to be transparent and knows empathy, and that's all you need. And now I think it's pivoted back, right? I think based on what I've seen and discussions I've had, and again, open to being wrong, but it seems like the CIO is one where you have to have this business skill and a technical skill, because companies need that leadership, right? What happened during COVID-19 and the remote work is companies needed people who could step up in both areas. So we're talking about GRC here. It includes that, understanding what GDPR is, understanding the California privacy regulations, understanding how to implement them, understanding how data loss prevention works, they need someone who can lead this, not someone who knows how to hire people to lead it. Now, I mean, if you're a CIO of a huge company of 10,000 people in just the IT org, then yeah, you probably can't know everything. But especially as you get to smaller to mid-sized companies, they need a CIO who can provide that actual technical leadership in the strategic plan without always having to have someone with him or her to explain the technical details of every single step. So, for example, with me, one of the things we started doing is rolling out data loss prevention. So we're warning on, social security numbers or credit card numbers or routing numbers, whatever that is, right? We have a number of different rules flag on. We have regular expressions that will flag on passwords stored in Teams files and such. And then we're going to start auto classification and then auto tagging of documents. next, and then be able to then put appropriate security controls automatically on the files at the file. And that requires someone who understands that and can learn about it and explain it to the board, can explain it to the other executives in a way that they can understand it. It can't necessarily be a CIO who doesn't understand it, but can hire a consultant to maybe do it. I think this is where you have to have this continued education. And I'm a big proponent of certifications. I think that they help teach you what's going on in industry. And whether it be a cybersecurity education like the ISC squared, CISSP, or one of those, you have to get a certain number of continuing education points each year to keep that certification. And I was asked to give one person advice on his resume. He had a this is in 2021, right? He had a certification from 2007. And I said, you're basically saying that you haven't learned anything in 14 years. By putting that one certification on there, it's better to take it out than call attention to that's the last time you got one. And I think sometimes when people reach this level, they stop learning, they stop growing, they kind of start coasting because they're, typically people reach the CIO or very senior level later in their career. Not everyone, some people have very great career trajectory, but many people it's, they're reaching at late 40s or 50s. And at that point, maybe they feel like they've done their time, but I think you still need to always keep learning. And there's books, there's podcasts, there's webinars, there's engagement, there's groups like Elevate, Exchange, there's other groups, and being engaged in an industry and being a constant learner helps you really demonstrate that you're a thought leadership. But then you have to execute on that thought leadership and use it in
right. Yeah, no, and I agree with that, right? But one of the things is, and while I appreciate the idea of certifications and being able to get those, for me, typically, budget-wise, you get such a small amount for training in most companies, and I would rather sit there and push that training dollars and the certification into the team that is going to be responsible for the execution more than putting something on myself. I almost feel like I'm cheating them if I take it for myself, right?
It involves money, right? But I kind of like challenged that just a bit. Is I was able to show my team that I'm doing it, and if it's important for me at my level to do it, then they need to do it, right? I pushed a lot of Azure certifications in my last role, but I was leading the team in certification count because I wanted to set the example. Now, again, it depends upon your budget, and a lot of the training I did was self-paced, right? There's some really great self-paced training out there, right? If you're having to, go through, like there are certain places, and I don't want to mention names, but there are certain certification groups where everything is a class, and a class is $6,000 or $7,000. I mean, like there's no way that you can do that. But if you can get, and we were getting free certifications because we did so many, right? They just started giving us free certifications, and so between the free learning, I use some online learning. I'm not going to mention the company, right? But they've been purchased a couple times. But there was a local vendor who did training around Linux and cloud, and it was a really great program, and it was $100 a year, $300 or $400 per person, and we take it away if people didn't use it. But the return on investment was incredible.
Right.
I mean, I think there's a lot of free training now. There's a lot of ways that people.
There is, right? But what you don't necessarily get with the free training is that actual certificate, right? That certification, and that's the part that typically I would rather spend money there on. I can take all the learning I want for myself and get it and gather it self-paced and on my own. But it's about, typically large dollars that are spent for that certification exam that has to be there and spending on that. And if I'm going to spend my limited dollars, I want to spend it on them. That's just always been my approach.
Right? I think like the Microsoft one's $150.
Yeah, Microsoft's not bad. Cisco's expensive. They're between $300 and $500 a piece.
They're expensive.
ISC Square expensive. Any of the idle foundations is pretty cheap, but you go beyond foundations, you start spending $3,000 and $4,000 a piece.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that. Right? There's no way in hell I would do that.
Yeah, COVID's about $1,800. PMP exams are about $5 to $6.
I'm talking a lot of like the Microsoft ones and
Yep.
AWS, right? Even Kubernetes was 300. I mean, like the Kubernetes ones were 300. It wasn't bad. They gave you a free retake as part of it.
No, that's good.
And the Kubernetes ones are actually lab-based, and they probably give you a third of the time you really need. So you have and they're open book, but if you need to actually read how to do something, you've lost, right? You go
Yeah.
to an open book, like you can copy the sample template and then know where to edit it, but it's very vast. So
let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about external access into your environment, right? The things that are going on when you have third-party vendors that are in it. So, now more than ever, we have to be more vigilant on who's accessing our environments, including the third parties that we partner with, contractors that are used. Just even, you got to worry about point-to-point VPNs between businesses, even at places. So, can you share what you have in place that addresses third-party access to your environment, or how you would want to approach it, and how it's managed for compliance-related points?
yeah, so I can kind of answer, but I do have to obfuscate some of it, right? Because they're potentially an attack vector if I disclose too much. But I've locked down SharePoint, right? So there's no anonymous access. Like people who are employees can't send a file through SharePoint, right? So it's completely locked down. And we just implemented Azure business to business. And so there's a business to business feature that users can come in and they have to authenticate through a one-time password, and they're added as a guest, and they would have access to only limited things. Now, what I think is a little bit challenging with the solution is I set up an extranet site, but all guests would have access to that extranet site. And so we have situations where we will need, different maybe subcontractors to compete against each other for bidding. And so I'm going to have to create a separate SharePoint site. And I don't, going to be some work. I'll have to get that scripted. And the challenge is now you got to educate the wider team on why this is necessary. Why does the vendor need to create a password? Why does the vendor need to have a multi-factor authentication? So, it's coming into our environment, and kind of the example I used yesterday. And it was like, if someone has malaria, are you going to let them into your house? No. Right? If they tell you, I might have malaria. I just came back from a country where malaria is common, and I'm not sure if I have it. I'm coughing, coming in the house. You're not going to open the door. And so when you have third parties, you don't know what their cybersecurity hygiene is. You don't know if they're coming in from their home computer, or anything like that, right? So that's the thing. And then you also want to have data loss prevention rules and auditing, and some of these new features in Microsoft Sentinel, user and entity behavior analysis, which is kind of using like a machine learning to look at how, what behaviors are seen within your environment. And the way I understand it, it reads and if I were to send 100 emails a day, that's one thing. But if I never send emails and then all of a sudden I'm sending 100, that might be something that's out of place. And so, there are certain vendors I'll create an account for, and I will, we use the most expensive small business version. So I'm going to spend more money to give this vendor an account, but I want to make sure that I have Windows Defender and advanced threat protection and all these different pieces on that person's account. We don't want to, get compromised for like, we get hacked, for example, and because we saved $12 on this one person, and you got to look and wow, it's a little bit of money, but what's the downside is you spent $12 more and protected yourself. So I think you probably have different ideas too on this, right? Some of that.
Well, yeah, no, I think there's a lot of it, right, that kind of goes along that, some of the things that, I'm also a believer in is controlling the type of device that's accessing your environment, right? So if you can manage that to where you've got them coming through, you know, a VDI type interface and everything else, so their device isn't actually touching the inside of your network, and doing that, that's always a big bonus. You know, having the fact that if they do have their device coming on your environment, maybe taking the point and spending the extra money and making sure that you have your EDR type solution running on their device so you can monitor and manage it if you need to, so that if something happens, so you don't expose yourself to a longer delay in getting something resolved and being able to block that out. Policy protection on VPN access to make sure that they have the latest updated antivirus and stuff in there before you allow it to be able to breach the network and come in. Things along those lines are safeguards at the gate that you want to put in place. Once on the inside, it is the things that you mentioned, right? Being able to manage your data and data access least privilege and doing those things. It was kind of funny. I was talking to a colleague the other day, and he was sharing how he was in a challenge with the business whenever he was wanting to implement a policy that said that they need to reveal their cyber posture, right? Of any vendor they're wanting to use. Have you been breached before? When was the last time you were breached? What do you use for an EDR solution? Things like that. And they were like, well, why do you need to know that about them? We don't want to do that. They may not want to work with us then, right? And it was that paranoia there, and it was literally they were worried about it being a roadblock and an obstacle whenever they forget about the part of, you know, protecting the environment and the IP that you have inside of your business. And it's a real challenge that goes on in getting the business the education to understand that, and more importantly, getting them to support it. And that's, you know, sometimes education is not enough to get that.
I think
Any
that's
thoughts?
found in many companies, even large
Yeah.
ones, right? Especially large ones. The one thing I'm looking at is I'm not going to mention it, but I'm looking at it's like a VPN, but it's more of an external VPN. So instead of me setting up VPNs across all the offices and having, you know, the VPN be a gate into each office, as we move mostly to a cloud first or almost a smart cloud only company, right? I want to make sure that employees aren't accepting certificates at hotels or wherever that decrypts the SSL, because they don't necessarily understand what they're installing. And there is a zero trust solution I'm looking at, which is like a VPN almost, and everything will go through this third party. And then I could set up some that to ensure that it's almost like VPN, but instead of me setting up a VPN for each company we get and trying to rig all that, you know, and into the cloud, it's just, there's a lot of work for that. And we're small enough companies. Some of the people are all remote anyway for the moment. It's you know, that whole traditional VPN.
Right. All right. Well, so and that kind of leads us into the next part, right? We were talking about the challenges with working with the business, and you know, one of the things that is near and dear to me is, you know, faced with dealing with people with security and GRC, they always, you know, seem to see it as an obstacle, right? You're keeping me from doing my work. You're hurting my productivity. But what do we do? How do we approach winning their hearts and minds of those people and getting them actually to become champions for us within the stakeholder community?
This is where maybe I disagree with some CISOs, but I've become very transparent with our business leaders regarding, you know, here's the number of threats, here are the ones that are coming in, here's what the tool stopped, here's you know, how many incidents we've had, how many alerts we've had, and demonstrate, you know, these are what the controls are putting in place. And then asking some questions. I'm like, if one of your people decided to start his or her own company and took all of your intellectual property, would that affect you? Of course, I said, oh, yeah, of course. I said, well, would you like me to protect that? Oh, yeah, of course. I expect you to know. Well, you know, this is why we need the data loss prevention rules, right? I know you want to share everything in Dropbox and send it to who knows where, but that means other people can send it who knows where too. So in trying to, but I think that part of it is having that empathy, but also showing them and being transparent with what's really going on day to day. And I know sometimes CISOs are reluctant to share any data, because any data can be used as a threat vector, and sometimes they would look at the employee as the biggest threat, which the employee is the biggest threat. The employee is also the biggest asset, and you have to see both sides of that equation. So I think transparency and showing them here's how we're solving it, is maybe where we didn't catch something, and help with that. I mean, they don't always like it when you isolate someone's computer. This person can't work now. Their computer's isolated from the network. Yeah, right? Because they clicked on malware. So yes, we've isolated the computer, right? We don't want everyone's computer affected with malware. We don't want.
But I need Joe to do his job now. Release it.
If he did his job, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in.
Exactly. And that's kind of an interesting thing. And one of the other approaches that, I always try to do is whenever they start talking about, well, this is going to cause me a problem, it's going to keep me from doing my job and everything else, I ask them to actually take me through it and how this will impact their job. Show me so I can better understand what I may need to modify or adjust so it doesn't create a problem for you, right? I don't believe in being an absolute, right? I believe there's opportunity to be able to make adjustments to make things work better, and sometimes you can't. I'll never forget one of the conversations that I had was whenever we were going to expire the token and the password for the salesman for Salesforce access. They wanted to never expire. They wanted to be able to do this, and so we wanted to start off at least at every 8 hours doing it, right, and force them to relog back in. And they kept even saying, well, even then, that's going to be a problem. And these are the reasons why. And so we offered them a compromise and said, okay, every time that you change networks, we're going to expire the token. So if you go from site A to site B and you jump on their Wi-Fi, then we're going to expire and force you to re-authenticate. If you go onto mobile data from there, then we're going to ask you to re-authenticate again, and we're actually to join VPN at that point, right? And anytime you're on a public network. And so they were all over that until they found out that they forced them to change it a lot more. So they were happy to go back to the 8 hours a day. But, and even then that was a stretch. It's probably more than we should have. But it was a compromise where they had never had to do any of that before. And it had to go in small steps. But, I think part of our job is to be enablers, not to be disablers, right, in what we do, while still creating that balance of protecting the environment.
Sure. I think, yes. And I think there are some things that are non-negotiable, and disk encryption or multi-factor authentication, right? That doesn't require, or it's not going to require consensus, right? MFA has to be done.
Yep.
You can't sit there and say, well, let's get agreement on whether we should do that. No, right? Making sure that people have a strong password. Now, Microsoft, in one of their documents, 365, recommends 10. And they basically say, if you go too far past this, it's just people are going to work around it. They're going to write it down on a Post-it note and put it on their, right? They didn't say it exactly that way, but that's what they mean, right? You can go overboard, and then people find ways around it. But
yeah, and I think the NIST guidelines, are 12 now, right now.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right there on 12. And with some of the phone management, we can force a strong password on the phone. No more 1111, right? They have to 10, which is 6, and it's complex, right? Meaning you just can't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or something like that. Because then once you're in the phone, then they can eventually you can get to someone's bank account in the HRIS system with the mobile app. Now someone's pay stolen. So that's always a good example to show them. It's like, hey, you know what? They can take your pay.
Yep.
So,
exactly.
It's real for them.
Yeah, we've got a little bit of extra time, and I wanted to come back and touch on something that you mentioned earlier. Talked about working on cyber insurance questionnaires and filling that out. And one of the things that I'm starting to see is that the cyber insurance carriers are starting to invoke their view of policy on businesses in order to provide them with insurance for an example, is the fact of requiring multi-factor authentication in all cases for everything. And some of the other things around password change requirements, how often they should be changed, and doing that. Is there a balance that needs to be found between the cyber insurance carriers mandating what you do and how you operate your business versus you being able to be insured? What should we?
Well, I just went through 6 different questionnaires, and
So you're an expert now.
Well, I'm not an expert at it, but and they did read it because they came back for questions, right? So let me try again. Can't disclose the whole situation about what we have, what we don't have. Your MFA was on there, how many users have MFA, right? And then it was, asking about disk encryption. Do you have a privileged access management system? Do you have backups? What's backed up? Do you have endpoint protection on all your servers? Do you have Log4j and all these other things? Do you have on-prem Exchange? And it just went on and on and on. But coming from GM Financial has a really good cybersecurity team and policies. Nothing in this questionnaire was wrong. Nothing in this questionnaire was, that's stupid. Right? Everything that the cybersecurity insurance company asked us was appropriate. Now, is it appropriate for a 150-person company? That's a little harder to give to get the best answer to, right? If you're a 10,000-person company, everything in that questionnaire, you should have it at 10,000 company. But between a 1-person company and 10,000, right, there's only so much that a smaller team can do. And so...
Or can afford, too, right? It becomes cost prohibitive at some point.
Like a security operations center is an expensive investment, right? And that was a question. Do you have a 24/7 security operations center? Well, a larger company will do that. A smaller company won't. But they had questions like, do you have reporting on unusual behavior of your administrative accounts? Okay. What exactly is unusual behavior? Where does that end? Right? Like, how do you define that? And so, we have alerts if certain accounts get used. We have, the anomalous behavior that Microsoft now has in Sentinel, right? Which is all this user behavior analysis, right? So there's ways around that to answer those honestly. But there was just a lot, right? Do you have any cloud accounts without MFA? Do you have these? Do you have this? And everything in that questionnaire was legit. Nothing was crazy. It was all, it was good stuff. I'm like, we want to get there, right?
It's actually, really, really nice to see the evolution that's happened. I remember the very first cyber insurance questionnaire that I did, which was probably about 5 years ago. I think it had a total of 5 questions on it. And now they're like 5 pages long with, 75 questions at some point, right? Depending on who you're looking at. And I think the granularity of the questions that they're asking for are all valid and they're all good. But I do tend to agree with you is I don't want them to think that one size fits all, right? It is one of those things.
Right, because they know how big your company is, and they know one of the questions they have is how many people you have in the company, how many people you have in IT. And if you have 3 people in IT, right, they may look at the company revenue is X, they're going to maybe look at it differently than, I assume they are, than if you're a 10,000 person company with 100 people in security, right? Because there's an expectation there. And there's also a different risk level, right? If you're a huge company like that, you can't have 10,000 people in a company and 4 people in IT, right? They're going to say you don't have, but it's company your size and the amount you want.
Well, as they say, people are the biggest threat to being breached, right? Is the human error factor that happens. And the more people you have, the higher the risk is that goes along with it. So it all equates. Well, I think we're at the end of this, unless you got something else you want to cover and talk about.
Oh, one more thing. You talked about, who comes in your environment and stuff. One thing that I am going to be implementing is I'm implementing right now Microsoft Endpoint Management Intune. And there's a compliance portion of that, which is the antivirus, the real-time threat protection, disk encryption, and you get to the point where you can deny someone's computer access if they don't meet all that level. of every single piece, and so that's something I will be turning on at one point once I get everything compliant to begin with. I can't turn it on until everyone's compliant, right? And then because then I'll be continually chasing that, but continuing to put rule upon rule upon. And,
right. So, question for you on that, and just because I don't know, and I think it's for a point of clarification. When you turn that on, is it only looking for Microsoft signature products, or is it looking at, say, they use McAfee for antivirus and malware? Would that be accepted, or can you control that?
I think you may be able to turn the rules on and off for that, right? I'm kind of using the default, not 100%. I know that what I do want is I want a single solution. I don't want one company to use McAfee, another company to use facet, another company to use Defender. But there are things you can turn on and off. That I'm pretty sure. I'm just kind of running the basics are, and there's different levels. Like you can have a perfect high, but
okay.
It's kind of a cool thing. I can kind of look at all this stuff and get inventory of products and.
Yeah, but it gets to be challenging, right? Because if as you grow as a larger corporation, right, you're going to have multiple vendors and everything else, and they're all going to be typically larger vendors that are all going to have their own standards that are in place. One guy may be using CrowdStrike for EDR and malware and antivirus. Another company may be using McAfee's products. Another could be using Symantec, and then you can go on and on and on, SentinelOne, et cetera, and Carbon Black as you go along.
Yeah,
are you going to choose not to do business with them because they're not using your product set? I mean, where do you go?
Actually, so when you look at maybe a third-party support vendor, there are some who, as part of their requirement, means you use their tooling, which is their EDR. And it's like, no, right. I just bought all this stuff. I'm not changing it. I'm not spending $119 per month per seat for this tool away. Right.
Yep.
And I'm not doing it. So, that can be hard. Because if you have 3 different offices with 3 different local support teams that help out, you can't have 3 different.
Yep. So the option is, do you outfit them with your gear then to be able to support your environment? Or
yeah, it depends what you want done. I just need someone to answer a question of, hey, you know what, how do I attach a file to SharePoint? I can't have that stuff coming into IT, right? I got a cloud engineer that I just hired, right? He's really going to be working on the Microsoft 365 and the security and all those alerts and moving with our cloud strategy. I can't be, explaining to someone how to reset their phone or how to make sure the phone Outlook and the web Outlook match. Right. Right. There are certain things that end users ask because there's an IT team that they never had before, but there's not. It's to deliver business value. It's there has to be some investment, right? It's a user. Many questions can be answered with an online search. How do I add numbers in Excel? Right. There's really good videos on that show you how to add numbers on Excel. That's not something that you put a support ticket in and say, show me how to add A1, A2, and A3.
Yeah.
It's really not. There's a lot of self-service that's available. It's just different.
Yeah, and completely agree, right? And that's where knowledge management comes into play, self-service portals, virtual assistants to be able to help explain all that, and moving more and more of that to a shift left technology and approach. So, Tom, I tell you what, man, this has been a pleasure. It's always great to sit and talk with you because I always get to learn something new. It's been wonderful. Hopefully the drought didn't kill your garden too bad this year. And
it was really bad. We got tomatoes growing now. And so there's 2 seasons here in Texas. So the first one is terrible.
Yeah.
And the next one is we get peppers and we get tomatoes and we get some tomatoes.
That's good. Excellent. I'm a big tomato fan, so you got to hook me up one day. We got to meet up.
We do a bunch of different ones. Like I said, I do anything that involves getting burned, cut, hurt. Right. I have to do planting, but I do the digging and.
The soil got a little hard this year.
I got mold too. Mold. Yeah, but
Wow. Excellent. All right. Again, thanks so much. And stick around for a second.
okay, thank you.